holding the microphone, freezing up just a little bit. It's rather a long title, so let's get to the graphic that illustrates the economic problem, in this case in India, that we would like to solve. Just looking at that picture of people at work, you understand the economy is not doing particularly well. You also notice they have not a very good source of energy. And you might see that they have environmental problems in the sense of the source of that power. You also notice they're all women. And it turns out that women in India in this situation are busy with daily activities, household chores, don't have time to become educated, to get jobs, to gain independence, which is necessary to make independent decisions about the number of children to have. So that's one of the reasons the population in India is expected to exceed that of China. But another problem we have is the government debt. It's a continuous roar. Here are the debts of some of the nations expressed as a percentage of GDP. In the United States, the gross domestic product is about $17 trillion per year. The national debt's a little bit higher. But that's the most optimistic version. If you do financial gap accounting, that is, take the present value of all future expenses for pensions and so on, and subtract that from that the present value of all future legal or by law sources of income, we're off by $200 trillion in the United States alone. We have a big financial crisis that we keep burying. Congress says it's kicking the can down the road. These are the kinds of risks we have. And it's not just in the US. Many nations have exactly the same problem. We have the problem of basically a collapse of our economy with all these kinds of problems that not only destroy wealth for wealthy people, but also can collapse our welfare states, which are even more common in Europe. The solutions we look at, austerity, well, many people feel that's not the right economic answer. More deficit spending is not going to pass a Republican Congress. People say, well, let's devalue our currency, that way we can export more and increase our economy. But if every nation does that, that's a standoff, so that won't work. I got some of these ideas from Simon Irish, who's a financial guy from England in Chicago a few months ago. And his idea is productivity growth. That's the one way in the past we've gotten out of these crises. If we can increase productivity, it gives us the opportunity to solve that. The last example you can remember is the Y2K crisis. Remember when the year 2000 was coming along, the digits 99 and zillions of computer programs that no one had the source code for were going to change to 00, and we risked the potential that power stations would fail, your car wouldn't work anymore.
Things would fly out of the sky.
Exactly. Well, that turned out not to be true, but it frightened enough businesses that they invested heavily in the enterprise-wide information systems from SAP and from Oracle. And that it turned out to be a little bit of a plus that pumped up the GDP by increasing vastly the efficiency of many businesses. These software systems are very impressive. You know, they go all the way from payroll, purchasing, supply chain, finance, sales, commissions, the whole bundle of wax. It's a very efficient system. So another opportunity, though, is cheap energy, cheap, clean energy. And if we can leverage that, perhaps that's the opportunity we can seize to grow out of our debt crisis. Don't forget, we still have the same environmental crises that are staring at us, from global warming and overpopulation, the competition for food and for oil, all these problems partly driven by resource contention from increasing population. Coal emissions alone, 13,000 deaths in the US a year from particulate emissions of particles of less than 2.5 microns emitted by coal power plants. You probably read a paper just recently by Hansen showing that nuclear power has saved over 1 million lives by not burning coal. I think the biggest problem with global warming is farming. We depend in a lot of areas on glacial water flow to continue watering fields and so on during the summer, but with no glaciers, there's no water flow, and it's going to be harder and harder to raise food. Back to, again, our issues about prosperity and work. I did a little plot here using CIA data. Here is, the dots each represent a country, and GDP per capita for each of the countries, and the number of children per woman. The stable replacement rate, on average, is about 2.2, 2.3 children per woman. And you can see instantly, looking at this graph, that the poorest countries are the ones that have the most children per woman. So the suggestion seems to be that if we could get up to a level of prosperity of about $7,500 per annum per person, we would bring countries and people into that regime where population growth does not occur, and we might end this ever-increasing competition for diminishing natural resources. Prosperity, of course, depends on energy. Same source, CIA, kilowatt hours per person per year, GDP per capita. It's pretty well correlated. And at our level of about $7,500 defined arbitrarily to be prosperity, that's about 2,000 kilowatt hours per year per person. I think that's, I forgot how many watts that is. I can't do the math that fast. But prosperity also depends not just on energy present, but cheap energy. Here's some suggestive data from the oil industry talking about what happens after oil price spikes. What happens is recessions. So that's one thing to worry about. It gives you the hint that it's got to be cheap enough, and that cheap enough is somewhere in the area of $100 a barrel. There's another point too, and that is, although energy may be something like 7 or 8% of the total GDP, its effect can be stronger than that. And if you do the incremental analysis, a couple of people have figured out that if you were to inject about $1 more free energy into the economy, you get $5 to $7 increase in GDP output. Energy is not the normal kind of commodity like cotton or platinum or something of that sort. It's really a very fundamental resource. And everybody knows this. So they want to burn more coal. The number of coal plants is projected to increase by 1,400 gigawatts. That's about the number of coal plants that exist today. Yes, everyone in the US says, isn't it nice we're retiring coal plants? The world is not. We're doubling the number of coal plants. Many people say, well, let's have carbon taxes. And we can't even get those passed in the US. Can you imagine passing them in developing nations? Here's the argument from the China Daily from a year or two ago. And they say, look, here in China, we have put into the atmosphere about 72 tons of CO2 per person. And you in the USA, over 1,000. So you want to talk about carbon taxes? Wait a minute. The OECD nations got their prosperity by putting that CO2 into the atmosphere. It's our turn. So talk to us when we get to that level. So I think the concept of convincing the developing nations not to burn coal on this basis is really impossible. Now the other thing to notice is, here's a book by Fareed Zakaria, Post-American World 2.0. His point really is that the world has changed a lot, and it's changed because of the developing nations, and it's changed a lot because of trade. Everyone depends now on trade, and there's no central organization to somehow say to make things happen. If there's an embargo somewhere, trade works around it. So the answer is economics is rules. We can pass all the political rules or treaties we want, but in the end, there's a workaround. Here's an example. We want clean energy cheaper than coal, and the IPCC reports have sponsored many meetings to solve this problem. Here they are. Kyoto failed. Copenhagen failed. Failed, 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 failed. In the end, Durban failed. That was the last one. 30,000 people went to South Africa to bleat about the problem, but no one solved it. And the reason is economics. Others say, okay, we need to use less energy. We have to be moralistic. We're robbing our future generation. Let's turn the lights down. So here's an example. We consume about 434 gigawatts a year, gigawatt years per year in the US. What if we were to cut that in half over a period of 20 years or so? Wouldn't that be good? Well, of course, other nations want to improve their standard of living. This is what's going to happen to electricity consumption under that scenario. That is, a 50% cut in use won't help because the developing world also wants a style of life similar to that of the US and other OECD nations. So what do? We want clean energy cheaper than coal. What does coal cost? Well, I'm going to go through a list of sources of energy and try and estimate their costs. I'm going to use a very simple model. What I do is I try not to rely on what the EIA says or some organization like National Renewable Energy Laboratories, but go to the market and try to find out what these plants actually cost. Okay, in this case, advanced coal plants, the high temperature pulverized coal plants, can be built for something like $2.08 a watt. And for figuring out how much that contributes to the cost per kilowatt hour, I just use Business 101 rules, right? And just 8% over, in this case, 40 years with a 90% duty cycle. And that's a convenient number too, because it turns out you just divide. So a $2.8 per watt investment turns out to be a 2.8 cent per kilowatt hour cost recovery charge. So that's not bad. So fuel at $45 a ton, about 1.8 cents a kilowatt hour. Ops, I just standardized, something like that. And it's true that different versions of PowerPoint display differently. But anyway, even the integrated gasification plants, what's that number at the bottom? I can't quite read, but costs about 5 cents. That picture there is a kind of a coal plant that burns coal in an oxygen atmosphere. That's sort of a precursor to the kind of coal plant that would capture carbon and store it because it makes it feasible to extract the carbon from the exhaust stream with all that noxious nitrogen in it. But natural gas. First you have to guess how much it's going to cost per million BTU. It started at $2 a few years ago, up to $4, retreated a little bit right now. I'm predicting about $5. But at $5, you can generate electricity for a price as low as that. And if the price drops a little bit, even lower. But that's using a combined cycle natural gas turbine. Combined cycle means burn the fuel in a jet engine and then take the heat and use it to run a steam boiler. And that works well, except that we don't use those to back up wind turbines. We use the older single cycle gas turbines. And that kind of electricity costs a bit more. Wind electricity. Again, we have, did anyone know how many wind turbines were built in the US last quarter? 0. Why? Because the 30% tax credit that used to be paid up front expired. They're going to pay it in arrears. So they didn't build, none came into service. So it's really a tax situation that's driving all that. Capital cost recovery. First of all, try and find out what it costs to build one of these wind turbines and just do the little bit of math 101 to convert that to capital cost recovery. In this case, I didn't use a 90% capacity factor. I used a 30% capacity factor because that's the typical number. And I cross-check it against some numbers. So for example, the state of Massachusetts blackmailed its utility company to basically buy electricity from Cape Wind at those kind of prices. So that gives me a reasonableness check on this kind of model. Solar power, same idea. We'll go around and find out what some of these plants actually cost. Do the math. Albiasa in Spain, 35 cents a kilowatt hour. All earth renewables, right in Vermont, is typically required, well, I'm sorry, the other way around. The utility companies are required to buy all of the solar power that all earth renewables can produce whenever. Their capacity factor is about, optimistically, 20%. Biomass, well, I was thinking about ethanol and all that sort of thing, but the most efficient thing you can do with biomass is just burn it directly, and we have wood power plants that do that. Same idea here, but that kind of electricity costs about 9.7 cents. You can see the fuel isn't all that cheap. After all, we have to cut it and then transport it all the way to the power plant in order to burn it. So, the answer is green energy is not cheaper than coal. We want energy cheaper than coal. What are we going to do? There's another point. Here's a graph of carbon intensity of the energy sector over the last few decades. And you'll notice that it hasn't gotten any better. Green doesn't work. Can nuclear work? Well, let's look at the history of nuclear for a minute. Weinberg, who was mentioned a couple of times about the molten salt reactor, has his name on the patent for the pressurized water reactor as well. And he's the one who convinced Rickover's team that that was the right solution for that underwater vessel. And Rickover had a lot of drive, and he was able to supply a lot of trained officers to run power plants. And basically, that was the impetus that created the 100 or so nuclear power plants we have in the US today. The question we now have is, can yesterday's solid fuel reactors compete with natural gas? Just in May, we saw Kewaunee shut down on economic grounds. Just last month, we heard that Vermont Yankee is going to shut down at the end of its fuel cycle on economic grounds. What about the new reactors? Well, the Georgia plant's going to cost $16 billion. That's $6 and something a watt of capital cost. They're using that same simplistic model. I say that's got to be 8 cents a kilowatt hour for power coming out of that plant. So is that going to compete with coal and natural gas? No, I don't think it will. On the other hand, China says they're building those same plants for $2 a watt. So we got to think about that problem too. Maybe there's another way to do it. Other people are thinking outside the box. Elon Musk thinks outside the box. Here's the situation at SpaceX. They focused on cost innovation as the opportunity. The opportunity was because the shuttle was a complex system and because it was based on 1970s technology. That sounds familiar. Innovation points. Entirely new rocket engine, small teams of people with low overhead, a new business, first flight 6 years after incorporation of that new business. The Falcon 1 cost $443 million. NASA's estimate for that project is below. It's an order of magnitude more money. So there is an opportunity, at least in the space world, for that kind of cost innovation, and it's a model for the innovation that we might see in the world of liquid fuel nuclear reactors. Fermi built the first one. It was never reached criticality. He used it to experiment with what was going to be the critical density of uranium in order to make a chain reaction. Here in this reactor, this is Richard Engel. Yeah, he's still consulting in the molten salt reactor business down in Oak Ridge. Here's a picture I lifted from National Geographic. So, but they worked on that way back in 1953. Well, Los Alamos also did a plutonium metal, a liquid plutonium reactor at one point. Well, Weinberg at Oak Ridge, you know the story about this reactor, and you know their story about this second reactor, the molten salt reactor. Just quickly, a little bit of almost physics here. Here's what happens in one of those reactors, and that is, in the center, we just put U-235 in it, and it fissions. But the other reaction that's common in all light water reactors is that the 238 in the fuel absorbs neutrons, eventually becomes plutonium 239, which is also fissile, and supplies about as much as a third or so of the power of the power plant at the end of the fuel cycle. Most people in the public don't realize that as much as a third of the energy from a power plant comes from burning plutonium produced that way. And you also see on the lower left, same concept for thorium and uranium-233. Okay. We can actually use all of these fuels at once in what's called the denatured molten salt reactor. So one big, if you will, a single fluid into which we inject U-235 and U-238 mixed together as a low enriched uranium source, and also thorium. Has a couple of advantages. One is that it's highly proliferation resistant, so it ought to minimize the opposition from that point of view. And we're going to talk about why it might provide energy cheaper than from coal. First of all, I just went through all the reports I could find and saw the cost estimates and just divided by the number of watts in the proposal and sort of accelerated them to the current time with inflationary numbers. And they're in the $2 range, more or less. The famous picture again. The low cost is partly due to the fact of the liquid fuel. Atmospheric pressure, good heat transfer, good volumetric heat capacity. That's the key technology. Kirk and I each have the word thorium in our license plate, but thorium isn't so much the critical issue. The critical technology is really the liquid fuel form. To the extent that we have simpler safety systems, it reduces the cost. The biggest one is there's no propulsive pressure of the fissile and fission products in the molten salt that could be pushed into the environment in the event of a problem. And Kirk talked about the freeze blood. And the other point is, even if you had a rupture, if you design the plant reasonably, that salt will spill out onto collectors and slowly solidify. It's not going to sort of vaporize into the environment. Low mass is another reason to get low cost. Remember, the mass originally was low enough to actually sit on an airplane wing. Here's a contra example. Here's the AP1000 being constructed in China. To me, it's just amazing how big some of these cranes could be. They're putting the cap on the dome there, 659 tons. It's impressive engineering, but it costs money. The other point is the high temperature. The high temperature means that we can be more efficient, but it also means that we can reject less heat into the environment. That means the heat exchanger and the cooling water and so on are diminished because we're operating more efficiently. Here's a Forsberg slide. His point is we can use the open air Brayton cycle in places that perhaps are constrained by not having adequate water supplies, and we pay a small penalty, maybe 40% efficiency thermal to electric conversion instead of about 45. And another slide you've seen, a little farther into the future, the supercritical CO2 cycle could be even less expensive, but we need more research before that can be determined. But even if you don't go that route, just stick with steam, it's not too bad. You're in the 40% range with some of the new products from Siemens. There's plenty of thorium. Kirk showed you something that was buried. He showed you that a cubic meter of dirt has as much thorium and energy as, what, 60 barrels of oil. My point is that if we could get into the production mode, the same mode that hopefully Empower will get into to produce these kinds of reactors, we can begin to get the benefits of factory production and also the learning curve that comes with that. The learning curve says that every time it's not a rule, it's just an observation, every time we double the number of units produced, we can reduce the cost per unit by some number. Typically, it's around 20% in the aircraft industry. In the IT industry, it's been about 50%. The conservative estimate for the nuclear industry is about 10%. But still, that says if we could build 1,000 units, we might cut the costs down to maybe 35% of what we started. So there's an opportunity that exists by modular factory production. If we could do one a day, by the way, that would be a $70 billion industry in the US. Not too bad. If we can install one a day worldwide to replace all coal power, we can eliminate all the CO2 emissions from all the world's current coal plants in about 30, 40 years. Some number like that. So, not too bad. Of course, that doesn't take account of the fact that the rest of the world is also planning to double this number, so we better get someone else to build more too. We can also produce hydrogen by high temperature dissociation of water, or a couple other ways. The copper chlorine cycle is an example of that. Some people are uncomfortable with hydrogen fuel, but I mean, you can buy several cars that are fueled by hydrogen. Here's the Clarity. It's reasonably safe. Everyone worries about the Hindenburg and so on, but remember, the Hindenburg didn't explode. The hydrogen didn't explode. It was a surface fire on the fabric. So, and in fact, the Russians did fly an airplane with hydrogen fuel. So that's a possibility too. But there are easier ways to transport the energy from hydrogen. One is ammonia, methanol, and of course gasoline and things of that nature. So that's a possibility. And we show here that this example is a car that's been touring the trade shows in Europe, and it runs partly on ammonia and a little bit of petro fuel from time to time. But mileage is pretty good. If you're interested in this subject, later, I think it's this month or maybe early next month, the NH3 Fuel Association is having a meeting out in California where they have a lot of papers on these topics. And they're actually going to do a bunch of demonstrations about what happens with ammonia leaks and explosions and ruptures live, outdoors, I hope. Well, what about carbon neutrality? How can we solve that problem? Well, we need the C, we need the carbon. If we do that, we can make things like methanol or J5 or whatever. We maybe can capture it from clean air, but Heather thinks we can do a job that's 140 times better by capturing it from seawater. So we ought to look harder at that. This has been on again, off again economically here, the capturing from air. And capturing from seawater is good enough, right? Because the seawater keeps capturing more and more stuff from CO2, so you're going to get it eventually. Also, biomass. People have been talking about ethanol, but they've also been talking about cellulosic ethanol, which hasn't really worked out very well. But we can do 3 times better than the goal for cellulosic ethanol by hydrogenating the biomass, not burning it. That is, don't look upon it as a source of energy, but look upon it as a source of carbon that we hydrogenate to carry that energy around. And there's some examples here. Cattle lung is a common fuel in a lot of places. You might use that, you might not burn that, you might hydrogenate it, but the cost of obtaining it and bringing it to the power plant is kind of high. In the West, many cities have an alternative to collect. Again, if we do this, we also get the benefit of more energy, creating more GDP. It might slowly lead us out of our debt crisis. Low cost is crucial to success here, and there are opponents to nuclear power who will try everything in their power to increase the costs. And that's something we need to avoid. Remember I said economics trumps politics. We want to focus on cost. So my recommendation would be focus exclusively for the first decades on getting that technology in the field, sold, established, and the way to do that is low cost. So for example, these nice features of various designs are great to have, but let's just say, suppose you said there was less spent fuel waste to be stored in Yucca Mountain. Is that a selling point? I mean, we have 60,000 tons of spent fuel now sitting around. If we only had 30,000 tons of spent fuel, do you think our opponents would have any less opposition to nuclear power? So think about all those selling points, like tritium production and so on. Is it reasonable to try to cut back and satisfy those people or not? There was a rally across the river from where I live against Vermont Yankee, conducted by people from Japan. They came and they talked about the radiation around Fukushima, and the numbers they quoted were in error. They were off by a factor of 1 million. And nobody noticed. Okay, so great things to have, but not every design needs them. I say the first designs to be commercially successful, to sort of get the wave rolling, the way Ricoeur got the pressurized water wave rolling, was to get sales, lower the cost. Economics always wins out. China is trying this. I went to a meeting over there late last year. This is the status of their project. It was mentioned again by Forsberg. And in that picture on the very left is Jiang Mianhen, who is the guy who got the money. His father was the previous president of China, so he was able to get $350 million for the project. The guy in the background, Xu Hongji, is in charge of doing the project. And I'm autographing a book for him, and I'll autograph the book for you over there. However, the future to me in the US does not look particularly good from the NRC. For example, just recently the chair said that the NRC is only concerned with safety, not cost-benefit comparisons and balancing. Even the EPA does cost-benefit analysis. The quality systems are very expensive. Quality systems always get more and more burdensome. In the medical devices field where I was, the first good manufacturing practice document was maybe 30 pages long. It was good. But now, of course, it's more and more paperwork. ISO 9000 has sort of become ISO 9finity. Many of the ventures, all but Kirk's, that I know of, are looking to work outside the United States. Again, this all really comes back to people's and politicians' fears of low-level ionizing radiation. And we seem to be, so far, unable to get people to really address the so-called linear no-threshold theory and replace it with a simple limit, such as we have for other environmental hazards. There's something called the as low as reasonably achievable guideline, which I call Python, because it's never going to let you go. It's always going to get worse, and so on. So all these problems, just as recently, by the way, no one noticed, but IAEA came up with a little brochure, about 100 pages, for governments to respond to accidents like at Fukushima. And their recommendations are evacuation in areas that exceed 200 millisieverts per year at 1 meter above ground level. You know, that's 200 or 100 times higher than the Japanese government is attempting to enforce, and it's clearly higher than what we do in the US as well. So we have lots of issues that have to do with the underlying fear of radiation that's leading to the creation of all these rules that make it really difficult to get this technology established. So, again, this is the innovating technology that might be able to not only solve the economic crisis, but also the climate, energy, poverty crises. Thank you.